we'll get started.
Okay.
Great. Let's go to the first slide. So this is our agenda. We plan to just give you a brief update on what the housing element is, talk a little bit about what our process has been for selecting sites to help meet our housing need and to provide, and then also to give you an overview about how you can provide feedback specifically on the sites using an online tool that we have called Balancing Act. And then we'll give you an update on our next steps. Next slide, please. So our goals, as you may know, we're kind of doing this what we're calling the roadshow. We're doing it around all around the unincorporated communities. And the goals are really to inform people about the planning process and our suggestions about how to meet our housing needs and our site selection process, as well as letting you know how to provide feedback and receiving feedback that you may have for us tonight, getting questions answered and getting your feedback on the sites, and then letting you know other ways to be involved, including the Balancing Act tool that I mentioned previously. Next slide, please. So this is actually, for a design review board, we can just go on from there. Since that one is base, that one's for if it was a design review board. The housing element is part of the county's general plan, and it is a plan about how we're going to meet the county's housing needs at all income levels. It's updated every 8 years, and it's unlike other sections of the countywide plan, it has to be reviewed and certified by the state. The agency is called the California Housing and Community Development Department. And every city, town, and community and county in California has to do their own housing element. The one that we're going to be talking about is for the unincorporated areas, and the cities and towns will be doing their own or are in the process of updating their own housing elements. And the adoption deadline that we are working under is to have the housing element adopted by the end of the year. Next slide, please. The number of homes that we need to plan for is driven by a kind of a wonky process called the regional housing need allocation, which is where the state kind of determines what the whole state's housing needs are based on job growth, population growth, and existing unmet need. And then they assign that out to communities to plan for. So for the Bay Area, the whole Bay Area's housing needs were about 441,000 units. For the county as a whole, including all the cities and towns, we need to plan for a little over 14,000 units. And for the unincorporated, about 3,600 new homes. And just to note, like, this is a significant number, and the county's accounts for about 3% of the Bay Area's total allocation. Next slide, please. So you can see here, this is going to be a challenge for us. This is a significant increase compared to where we were in previous housing elements. In fact, our last housing element, the one that is our current one, we only had to plan for 185 new homes. The previous cycle was 773, etc. So, this is of note that this is going to be a challenge for our community, and planning for this number of new homes is really going to involve some changes which can be difficult for many of us who live here in the county. And it'll also involve some significant choices and trade-offs that are going to have to be made in order to accommodate this number of homes. I also wanted to note that we need to plan. Normally, you hear mostly about the affordable piece of the housing needs and the housing element, but really we need to plan for housing at all income levels, from extremely low income to very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And there's a percentage of those in the housing element that we need to plan for. And each of those housing types has different housing types that I'll talk about a little later. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about the type of housing that we currently have. Not surprising to anybody, our preponderance of our housing is single family detached housing. And we have a little bit of multifamily housing and a few mobile homes. And also of note here is that over time, over our last, I'm not sure the period is, but during our current housing element, we have only developed 237 new homes. So this, I think, really puts in perspective the challenge that we have in front of us. On average, we've only developed about 30 new homes each year. Next slide, please. So as we're evaluating and trying to designate housing sites, the first thing that we have to take into consideration, or one of the many things that we have to take into consideration, is how the state will evaluate sites. So they review a lot of specifics about the sites, looking at things like, is the site size suitable for development? What's the realistic potential that those sites would actually develop within that 8-year planning period? Are there existing uses on the site that may be barriers? And what is the development density? Next slide, please. The one thing that is important to note is that the state looks at density as a measure of affordability. They say it's a proxy for affordability. So for homes to be affordable, because of the high cost of land and development in Marin, housing has to be built at higher densities in order to be affordable. And housing types typically become more affordable as you move from large single family homes on a large lot up into a more dense types of housing. Next slide, please. And one of the tools that we're using to designate or to identify sites are guiding principles that were considered by the board and the Planning Commission at their workshop in December, where they said, in order to, here's some tools that you can use when you're evaluating sites, here's some guiding principles to do that. So one of those guiding principles was looking at scenarios that would ensure countywide distribution. So really looking at housing in all of our communities. And you'll see that later when we show you the overview of the map, that we really, that's one of the strategies has been looking at housing in all of our communities. Another was to really address racial equity and historic patterns of segregation that exist in our communities, and really focus housing that is for lower income communities or lower income households, particularly in communities that are considered higher opportunity. Another was to encourage infill and redevelopment opportunities. So really looking at development within our existing communities and ways to maybe densify some of our commercial areas, et cetera. Another, we're also updating the safety element, which is looking at how we can adapt to climate change. And one of the guiding principles was looking at environmental hazards that are identified in the safety element and considering that as we're identifying sites. Another was really to leverage surplus lands, and finally to ensure a robust public engagement around all of the sites. Next slide, please. So we looked we have some consultants who are working with us who really did a planning exercise and looking at a variety of types of sites. We looked at vacant residential sites, so where there's already existing zoning, and there are vacant parcels. Not many of those around, as no surprise, but we started there. We looked at sites that are either have been approved and not built, or are in the pipeline. And those are called credit sites by that's the state's term. We also looked at accessory dwelling units or second units as a way of meeting some of our housing needs. We looked at publicly owned land. Was there, and just to note, this is not parklands or dedicated open space. We are looking at other types of publicly owned parcels. An example of that is a parcel that's owned by the state in unincorporated Larkspur, where there's housing proposal that is that's under consideration there. We also looked at the possibility of increasing densities in existing residential areas, and that may require some rezoning and increased zoning in those areas. Adding additional zoning capacity on some of our commercial sites, as I mentioned. And then a strategy that we focused on fairly significantly was looking at religious institutions, not looking at replacing that use, but looking at those parcels. There may be some excess parking or some other part of the parcel that's underutilized as a source of housing. This has been particularly successful in developing affordable housing. Many of you may be familiar with the Victory Village property that was previously owned by a church in Fairfax, which resulted in a significant number of affordable homes for seniors. We've also looked at school sites with the shrinking enrollment. A number of schools may be interested in developing housing, particularly for their staff and teachers. And so that also is one of the strategies that we looked at. And then finally, looking at conversion of existing multifamily housing that is market rate to permanently affordable. Next slide, please. So the preliminary assessment that we've done, in addition to these proposed strategies on sites, we're looking at constraints to development, which may require changes to our countywide plan, including community plans and development code changes. So there's some policies and programs that will be included in the housing element. We also did a comprehensive analysis of the sites, and we'll be taking into consideration environmental hazards, infrastructure, natural resources, and related factors to help us identify housing opportunities. And sites will also be evaluated in the EIR as we go forward. Next slide, please. Also of note is we evaluate realistic capacity assumptions. So we can't just look at the fact that a parcel may be zoned appropriately. We have to be realistic about our assumptions when we're looking at vacant residential land or underutilized residential. So we have to look at what patterns and what is realistic development in this community. Next slide, please. This is a map that you can see at a very high level that we have housing in all of our communities. We've really made an effort of doing that, since that was one of the strategies that the board wanted us to look at. And it's this is an initial list of candidate sites. It's only the starting point. And we have identified more sites, and in many cases, more units on those sites than what's needed. And that was a strategy so that we'd have some choice. We can go and listen to the community and then share that feedback with the board and planning commission, so that they also will be able to have some choice in limiting some of those sites that we don't need all of them. So we've really started at a much higher level with more units and more sites than we need. And we'll go down from there. Next slide, please. And finally, we've put together 4 scenarios based on the guiding principles that I talked through: ensuring countywide distribution, addressing racial equity and historic patterns of segregation, encouraging redevelopment and infill opportunities, and considering environmental hazards. And so you'll see Aline will talk a little bit more about those scenarios when she talks about the balancing act tool. But that is our starting place. And after we have received feedback from the community, we'll be going and presenting the board with some options based on these different scenarios. And I think now I'll turn it over to Aline to talk a little bit more about balancing act and opportunities for engagement, and then we'll answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you, Lily. Yeah, I'll start by going through our main mechanism for collecting sites feedback. I'll show you how to access the tool, the intent of the tool, and then I'll show you other avenues as well to share feedback and suggestions with us. So to begin with Balancing Act, it's like I mentioned, our main mechanism for collecting specific feedback about sites and the public's perspective on where units should be located. So it's accessible through our Marin County website, the Marin County Housing and Safety Elements page. We'll put it in the chat in just a moment. This is just a zoom in of that. And actually what I'll do is I'll go ahead and share my screen on the actual website. So once you get here, you can access it from the quick links here or through the icon that was in the presentation. And that leads us to a page with some information about Balancing Act. We have a demonstration video here, some frequently asked questions. We're also holding some office hours, which we'll go through in a bit. But as Lily just pointed out, we have these 4 scenarios right here. And essentially the goal is for the public to choose the one or several scenarios that they agree with the most and to complete the Balancing Act exercise for that scenario. So for example, picking out the countywide distribution scenario. So once you log in, you're greeted with a bunch of instructions. There's more details about the specific scenario and the sites that are included in that. You can enter your postal code as well here. So you'll notice that there are some sites on the map. These are also detailed in this list below. All the sites have units associated with it under this scenario. You can also see at the top, there is some language that indicates that the housing plan is satisfied and a green check mark. So essentially the scenario is pre-populated with unit information that you can then alter based on your perspective and your opinion. So for example, if there were a specific site that you wanted to see less units on, for example, you'll notice that the bar at the top turns red. And so then the goal of the tool named Balancing Act is to then balance that out with units on another site or several sites to then balance out that unit count. The tool also allows you to enter specific comments about a specific site, something that you want us to consider, or something that you particularly like about the site that should be noted here. And then at the end, you would click submit for the scenario to be taken into consideration.
And Aline, maybe we should also note that not every single one of the sites is in the Balancing Act tool. It's one of them, and you'll probably talk about that a little farther down.
Thank you, Lily, for pointing that out. Yes, so the Balancing Act scenarios contain most of the key sites. So this includes larger sites, sites with a lot of units, and sites that are already zoned, or sorry, sites that could require rezoning. So we want to get that perspective. So those are the key sites here. Just to go back once more, we have the complete list of sites available in several different places. One, there's this section here called List of Candidate Sites. We have lists by geography and generally, and we also have an interactive map that you can use to see every single site under consideration. We also have another tool on our main page. So going back to the main page, next to the Balancing Act icon, there's a housing site suggestions icon. On this map, we have the sites populated in here. So the purple sites are the candidate housing sites. This tool is also being used to collect specific feedback about sites, specific comments. And this tool is also being used to collect other ideas about sites that we haven't considered yet, that may be worth looking into. So we have some folks in the community that have already started populating some suggestions and ideas. Anything to add, Lily?
I don't think so.
So I'm gonna just go back over to presentation. Those are the scenarios.
Well, while she's doing that, I would just note that there's lots of different ways we're trying to provide a lot of different ways of providing comments. And one is the online Balancing Act tool. We think that gives a good opportunity for people to realize what some of the trade-offs are when we're evaluating sites. And if you don't want it here, then where should we put them? Another is that the map that Aline pointed out, where you can either say, you can put a comment on every single site, or you can suggest additional sites which may not be there. And then you can always send us an email, and you can send voicemails, or voicemails, emails. So, and lots of different ways of being involved. And we're also collecting the comments that we'll hear tonight and from these other meetings. Sorry, go ahead, Lily.
Thanks for clarifying that, Lily. Yes, exactly. And so you may have heard that in addition to this meeting, we're holding many others. There are several more coming down the line. Tomorrow we're in Marin and Lucas Valley, and then next week we have several meetings as well. So you're encouraged to attend any of the meetings that you're interested in. And then moving on to the Balancing Act office hours that I mentioned, we're holding several office hours, one actually tomorrow from 7 to 8, next week as well, and then the following. And this allows you to come in with your specific questions about how to use the tool. We'll have staff in a more intimate setting to answer those questions. And then to clarify, so the Balancing Act tool is going to be open through actually February 28th, Monday, February 28th. So through the end of the month, you can use the tool and submit any comments. So I think what we'll do is we'll pause. Check the chat for questions. I don't see any. We can also pull up the map and look at sites too.
Yeah, why don't we stop and see if anybody has questions or comments, and then if not, then we'll go, and if you could pull up the sites list.
So, I mean, I'm not sure if you want it all in chat or if we can just talk.
No, you can talk, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Where exactly is this site, and where can we view all of the site? Where is it? I'm assuming it's a website. So what is it?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it's marincounty.org/housing safety elements. You can access everything from there. We've also got them in the chat. If you have access to that, you can get the link directly there.
Sorry, I'm still on a phone, but I pulled off the road. And then and so the list of sites, so it'll show everything in Ross Valley.
Yes, and we're going to pull it up after. We can pull up that site list of the Ross Valley sites after we see if there's any other clarifying questions here.
Yeah, this is Renee Boss. I have a question. In those 4 scenarios that you have, since there's not that much discussion about natural resource impacts, is it assumed that those issues have already been screened out, like areas been screened out for environmental impacts? For example, endangered species habitat, sensitive riparian sites, or areas that are Native American sites, those sorts of things? Have those things already been screened out?
So those are in our GIS analysis. So if they're mapped and in GIS, they would have been taken into consideration. And also we'll be doing an EIR, an environmental review report on the housing and safety elements that would further study both, environmental constraints on the sites and infrastructure needs. So yes, those would be considered. And, given that our county has such strong environmental protection policies, those are also, fairly well documented and would have been considered as we're evaluating sites.
And how is the the drought and the water issue factoring into this whole process? Because just trying to look at this objectively from a standpoint of water use. I mean, we have such little water, and there's this huge number thrown at the county, which it seems almost impossible to meet both the housing need and the water for that need. So how is that being taken into account?
Yeah, Renee, that's a really good question. And, I live in West Marin, so I drive by the Nicasio Reservoir where a few months ago, seeing how low it was, this is definitely something that I've thought about. And we reached out to the state and asked them kind of how this would be factored in. And the answer is that the housing element is intended to be for a longer period of time. So it's a planning period of an 8-year planning period. So they're not only looking at what's happening now, although it would be easy to make the point that, it's likely that it's maybe the new normal. But what they've said is that and we do consult with the water districts as part of the process. The other piece is that what we need to demonstrate that there is a program in our housing element that would address the water shortage through adding additional capacity, for example. And one thing that's also kind of under consideration is looking at recycled water. Our county really doesn't do a good job compared to a lot of other communities around recycled water. Most of our fresh water doesn't go to used by people, it's used to water lawns and gardens. So, and there's a lot of opportunity for looking at ways where you could do a much better job, and that water, you could be using recycled water for that type of use when it's on landscaping and lawns, et cetera. So that's another option to look at, looking at some of our infrastructure dollars that may be coming available through the state and federal government at expanding those recycled water options. So it's a really hard thing. And I think that the water issue does make it's one of the hardest things I think that we're considering right now as we're planning for new housing. But thanks for that question.
Just a quick follow-up, and sorry I'm taking a lot of questions, but let me just give you an example. The community of Bolinas, you're familiar with the fact that they haven't added a new water meter there since the 50s, and you have to have a new water meter in order to build a new house. Are they going to be forced to start, increasing development despite their local requirement to have, these constraints?
No, there isn't any. So the housing requirements we have are for the unincorporated county as a whole. They're not broken out by community like that. And so, yes, the water moratorium has been in effect since the 73 in Bolinas, and there isn't any change to that that's proposed in the housing element. There is, an affordable housing provider that's looking at creative ways of using one water meter to serve multiple households, reducing landscaping use, et cetera. And they've been successful in doing that. And so there's, that's a way of kind of within that local framework, planning for more housing, but also acknowledging those local constraints that are there. So Aline, do you want to go ahead and share that map so that we can look at it, unless there's any other questions?
There's one more that came in.
There's one more?
It's
okay,
related a bit
okay.
around whether we discuss traffic and safety, i.e. evacuation issues vis-a-vis the proposed housing locations.
Yeah, that's a good question. And fortunately, we're updating our safety element, which is really about climate change adaptation. And, there's a specific focus on fire and fire hazards. And so when we say one of the scenarios that we have is avoiding those hazards, and that's one of the scenarios, and one of the guiding principles was really having that as a focus. And that is one of the considerations. Yes.
And then around traffic within the environmental review.
Yes, the traffic we have. So there's a couple things that we're doing around traffic and circulation. We'll be doing some additional traffic and circulation studies over the next month as we're studying our sites a little further, and specific, particularly in places that have extreme traffic situations. And then the environmental review document will also further study this for all of the sites that end up being selected through the housing element. So do you want to talk this through, Aline, or do you want me to?
Sure. Yeah, just that the map includes the potential housing sites under consideration throughout the entire unincorporated area. And we can zoom in on the unincorporated Fairfax, San Anselmo area and have specific conversations here. I don't know, maybe Lily, you want to drive the rest?
Yeah, so the blue site there is Santa Monico School, and at the end of Sleepy Hollow, and there could be, we've evaluated, there could be some additional development potential of up to 90 homes that would, that could serve staff and teachers if they so chose. Also, I think it's important to note that if a site is selected on the housing element, it's a permissive, not a requirement. So the owner would be allowed to pursue that development on the site, but they are not required to do it. So I just wanted to make that note. So this site, I think, is one of the ones that we've identified that that is going to need some further analysis around traffic and circulation. So that would be done in the next few months as we're further evaluating the sites. And then another kind of site in this part of the community is if you want to zoom in on there, it's this is the little shopping center there, right? Is that what this one is? Oh no. Oh, sorry. This is the TAM. Don't we have that Fairfax? Oh, we're not seeing. Yeah, that's it. So the Manor site there, there in Oak Manor, there's a little 7-Eleven, there's some other little businesses there, the pizza place, and it has a really large kind of underutilized parking lot that it goes around the sides. And so there could be some additional potential on that site, up to 25 possible homes. And the other site that she was looking at is out in the San Geronimo Valley. It's also the colors are I don't know if there's a little key, but the colors are coded. This is also a school-owned property. It's owned by the Tam Union High School District, and this it's a significant it's a larger site. It has potential of up to 98 homes, and it was purchased by it's been owned by the Tam Union High School District for years and years. They initially had proposed to build a new high school out there, or another high school out there, when they thought that there was going to be a lot of development in that area, and then it has been underutilized since. So that also could be a place for teacher and staff housing if it was chosen. Then I think the only other sites in this area are, let's see, over, if you zoom in a little bit by that Soric Park area. This is at the end of San Francisco Boulevard. There is a couple of sites there, including the Subud Center. That also is an example of the strategy that I talked about, where we could consider possible housing on religious institution sites. And that had, I think, up to 16 homes. And then, oh, no, up to 4. Sorry, I'm on the wrong site. 4. All right. And then across the way, you may be familiar, there's the courtyard, the San Anselmo Town courtyard, and then there's some other kind of smaller apartments in front of it. And that site has an opportunity for redevelopment and adding some additional housing there. And I think those are all of the sites. Oh, and the brown one, oh, that's an existing credit site that already has entitlements for 6 homes. So that would be included as a credit site, since it is in the pipelines. So if you want to just zoom out a little bit, those are all the ones in the Fairfax, San Anselmo area. Does anybody have questions or comments about those sites?
I do. Can you hear
go ahead,
me?
Beatrice.
Yeah,
Yes.
I live up at the top of Sleepy Hollow, and it seems like all of the other sites that you talked about in this area have better access to get back down to main thoroughfares like Sir Francis Drake and out to, San Rafael. Santa Monico School is on Butterfield, and that is one way in and one way out. And we already have almost 900 families living up there. And I think one of the biggest concerns of probably many people in my community is, what if there's a big fire? It's going to be very difficult to get down out of that area. We've already had some problems with a resident who the fire department wasn't able to reach them, and their house burnt down. There was a death, I think it was last year. We have very spotty cell phone service up here. This seems like not a great site to be included in this study, from my point of view. I'm surprised that there aren't more people on from Sleepy Hollow that are, and listening to this presentation, because it's very concerning to me, for sure.
I hear you. Yes, thank you for that. We are taking notes and recording this. Yes, circulation and traffic is definitely something that we've heard about in other communities. And as somebody had mentioned earlier, thinking about that in the context of fire is important. So yes, that is something that would be considered.
That's great.
Thanks for your comment.
You're welcome. It's about 2 miles from San Domenico School on that small thoroughfare down to Sir Francis Drake. That's a long way, with 800 families trying to leave at the same time. So yeah.
Thank you.
I have a comment. This is Renee Voss, the San Geronimo Valley parcel. It's my understanding. I'm actually on the a new land trust group called the Coho Salmon Land Trust, and we have a member of the Coast Miwok Council of Marin on our board, and he does AB 52 work, which is part of the CEQA requirement for Native American sites, and they believe that that site is an ancient village site for the Coast Miwok. The other thing is that the entire San Geronimo Valley area is critical habitat for both coho salmon and steelhead trout, including the headwaters. of these creeks. And there's a creek that runs right through that property. It's also a significant view shed that leads right into, most people that go out to Point Reyes go through there. So the impacts, I mean, it's such a visual area that the impacts, those kinds of impacts should also be taken into account. I'm curious about that last part too, because I don't know whether that is being factored into the equation, to say nothing else about the endangered species or Native American sites. What's the visual? Is there something visually part of this whole thing that needs to be considered?
So the Native American concerns would be obviously part of the environmental review. There's a consultation process that you sound like you're familiar with, and that would definitely be part of the environmental review process, as would any impact that may be on any kind of endangered species. It is a fairly large parcel, just so that and that would also be factored in. As far as viewshed, viewshed is a fairly subjective thing. It's not something that we can measure in our GIS mapping tool, for example. And so that is something that would be, we'll take that note down, we'll share that information, but that's really something that the board and planning commission would have to evaluate as they're thinking about all the other trade-offs that we're hearing about, including, impacts on environmentally sensitive areas or traffic or fire. There is one of the trade-offs that they would have to evaluate against, as they're comparing those trade-offs and considerations. Did anybody else have comments or questions? Anybody that we haven't heard from? Looks like there's a question in the chat, Aline.
Yeah, let's see here.
Should we just go ahead and read them out?
So some folks are agreeing with the speaker about San Domenico sites. I just want to point that out. I think that the comments are related to. Yes.
Okay, there's also a question about sewer capacity and upgrading. And again, that would be, those infrastructure needs would be evaluated as part of the CEQA review process. Unfortunately, there are infrastructure dollars or are part of the infrastructure bill that could support things like that if there was going to be additional housing.
So can I ask another question?
I think that Kathy, did you have a sorry, Kathy, did you have a question first? You're on mute, Kathy.
I was just typing something, but I'm not sure even who spoke, but it has to do mainly, and it's not just a particular site, with traffic and fire. It's, to me, that's very, we live in Fairfax, so I'm from Fairfax. And, it's going to be a matter of time before something does happen. And if there's a small accident on Drake, it's 2 hours out of here. I'm just not sure what could be done so taking that into consideration, the traffic, cars, and you can't say maybe you can't say no cars, because then we have to increase the bus system, which I'm not sure if that's going to be ever able to do that. But I'm just really concerned about that. And it's not good now. I don't know how I don't see how it's going to get better. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that comment. Beatrice, did you have something else that you wanted to add?
No, Frank did. Frank.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry.
All of the sites that with the exception of San Domenico, they look like they're institutional sites. Did you look at any of the larger properties that have been that are have been unimproved?
So in the unincorporated areas, the kind of the Ross Valley area, we looked at religious institutions, we looked at schools, we have that one commercial site, but within the unincorporated portions of this part of the county, there wasn't any other large undeveloped sites. There are other parts of the county, and we can look at the whole map if folks are interested in that. You know, there's sites all over the county, including the where the juvenile hall facility is. It's county owned property in Lucas Valley. The St. Vincent's property is included. You know, there's
What's the
properties
criteria?
throughout
What size criteria did you use?
I'm sorry.
How large a piece of unimproved land do you need in order to be considered?
So it depends on the type of housing that you're developing or the type of housing that you're planning for. So we have to plan for housing at all income ranges, including, you know, very low, moderate, and above moderate. So an above moderate could be as small as just a single family lot that's undeveloped. And there's a number of those in some of our communities where, you know, in Point Reyes, for example, there's a number of undeveloped lots, vacant lots, and those would be considered, those were included for above moderate income. If it's a site for affordable housing, then there's more specific constraints about the size of the property. So it has to be more than, you know, there's a range of it. So it has to be more than half an acre in order to be able to accommodate at least, I think, 16 units of affordable housing in order to be considered feasible. So to answer your question, so that was a long answer. It depends on the type of housing that we were evaluating it for.
So, I mean, there are some, you know, there are privately owned, you know, parcels in this area that aren't developed.
If there's things that we missed, then there's that map feature that we would love to have people add them on. There are, because we also considered that the site by Soric Park is privately owned, but if there's other privately owned parcels that we missed and that you think would be a better place for housing, then you can send us an email with those, or you can put them, Aline just dropped the link to the site suggestion map that you can put those on. If you don't know the address, you can just kind of put it on by the site and describe it, and we can probably find it also.
Sure. Okay. So if these, and the reason that you've, just to be clear that that this is to sites that are selected or sites that are put on this map, do the developers get benefits of any kind, or is this just, these are places that could provide additional housing? Is that basically what it is?
Yeah, so currently this is just here's this whole analysis that we did where we thought, like, this is all the places around the county that we think could be candidate sites. Nothing has been selected or identified yet. So this is just this early phase that we're going out and saying, like, oh, this is what we got. What do you think? What's your feedback? Once we narrow the list down and the sites are included in the housing element, there isn't any specific funding that's offered for somebody, but it does indicate to a developer, if you come in with an application that's consistent with this, then the county really needs to, then it really should increase the certainty that a developer has for developing a property, right? We can't put something in our housing element and say, oh, we think that you could develop this many units. And then when a developer comes in, say, oh, actually, no, you can only develop 2 there, right? So it really needs to be consistent with what we think is realistic development potential. Of course, there would be, we do an environmental analysis, but there's likely, especially if it's a larger project, there likely would be an additional environmental impact, which could identify some additional constraints that we weren't aware of. And in that case, and of course, you could have fewer units or lower density on that site. But in general, it really indicates to a developer, if you come in with a proposal that's consistent with this, then you should have a high level of certainty that that project would be approved as long as it was consistent with that.
Sorry, so out of this, there may be recommendations for change in zoning in order to accommodate additional housing?
Yeah, so one of the, when I said that we started by looking at existing development capacity, we looked at that. We looked at our accessory dwelling units. We looked at those sites that are in the pipeline or were under consideration. And we still had a significant gap, right? We don't have enough sites that are zoned appropriately, especially for our lower and moderate income housing. So there is going to have to be changes either in zoning or programs and policy changes. So that is something that is going to have to be done for the county to get a certified housing element. We don't have adequate zoning as is for lower and moderate income housing.
We do have a question in the chat from George around how the number, this one specifically 56, of low and very low housing units were assigned to that particular site.
Which site is that? Sorry.
I'll pull that up.
Okay. We'll look at that. I don't know them by number. If you said it by name, I probably would, but I don't know them by number yet. But again, the analysis that we looked at was often, it depends on the type of housing that was planned there. And so that's likely the scenario.
I don't see that one specifically. George, you're welcome to come off.
Oh, San Domenico. Are you asking about San Domenico, George?
Yes, I see it there in the.
Okay.
Yes, that's the one.
Okay, so the homes were assigned to San Domenico. We looked at some underutilized parking area. It's kind of a flat spot that, because most of the site is fairly hilly. So we looked at that flat parking lot that looks like it was kind of an underused parking lot. And then also at in their existing master plan, there's a dorm that they had entitled that was never built. And so we looked at those two areas as the possibility for, that was the area that was studied for housing.
Don't see any other questions in the chat. We have a couple more minutes left. If there are any other questions? One more from Liesel. Whether the county has an exclusionary zoning ordinance and how can we incentivize 100% affordable to meet our low income housing quotas?
So the county does have an inclusionary housing policy. We require 20% of any new development to be affordable to lower income households. There's also other tools as programs and policies that we can look at as far as incentivizing affordable housing, where we offer fee waivers to affordable housing development. The county also has an affordable housing trust fund, which can be used to help offset or help provide some of the local match that's often required when affordable housing is developed. Most affordable housing is funded by state and federal tax credits, but local funding is also needed to make that, to be competitive for those kind of funds. So those are some of the incentives. But the housing element will also be evaluating. In addition, most of the attention goes on the sites, but there's also a whole section of the program where we look at programs and policies, and some of those programs and policies may be around affordable housing. What we've heard from neighbors in Kentfield was that they were mostly interested in seeing affordable housing, and there was a lot of support for adding affordable housing, less so for market rate housing and more for affordable housing. And so that's the type of comment that we'll also be sharing with the board, so that when we're looking at programs and policies, that could be considered. I think there was a comment about San Domenico. and it being isolated, one possibility for San Domenico, if that site was considered, is that that could be for teacher and staff housing. And it could be both for teacher and staff there at San Domenico, but also for other local schools in the Sleepy Hollow area. So that may be a way of addressing the concerns about traffic, especially during those peak hours. So that, that would be something that, of course, that would be up to the property owner, but that could be a possibility. All right. So just if folks have more comments, there's lots of ways to provide feedback on the website. There's also links to those other upcoming meetings. Future board and planning commission workshops are all up there. Also contact information if you want to send an email with further questions is also there.
Hey, before you go, I tried to add this, to add an address on your map, but it doesn't show the address. So you might look at 0 Holstein.
Holstein?
Holstein.
Okay.
It's 22 acres.
Great. We will look at that.
Thank you very much. I tried to add it, but it doesn't show that address on there, but it's there.
Okay. That's perfect. You can always just tell us or send an email or anything
No
else.
I was trying to do it.
Okay.
Side, but...
No need to do it fancy. That just the addresses. That's
For
fine.
a general description of the
Yep.
area, we'll do.
Yep.
Yep.
Actually,
We'll
I
look
know
at
that property is actually a ridgeline ordinance property. It can't be developed. So
It's actually not true, but you could take a look at it anyway.
at the end, there's a place you can put a house, but not up on the ridge.
We'll look into it. Thank you.
More research.
Thank you both for your,
I live in that neighborhood. Thanks.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you. All right. Thanks everybody for being here. We really appreciate your time. Appreciate everybody's feedback and your insightful comments. And please stay involved. There's lots of other ways to be and to provide feedback and comment. And we really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
President of the